Welcome to the Ducks Unlimited podcast, the only podcast about all things waterfowl. From hunting insights to science-based discussions about ducks, geese, and issues affecting waterfowl and wetlands conservation in North America, we bring the resource to you. The DU Podcast with your hosts, Chris Jennings and Dr. Mike Brazier.
Today I've got my co-host with me, Dr. Mike Brazier. Mike, how are you?
I'm doing well, Chris. How are you?
Doing well. You know, we've had this conversation offline many times, and it involves being able to properly and effectively identify waterfowl. Now, whether it's in hand or on the fly, we've talked about this as far as the hunter's perspective, but I've talked with you about it even as far as like the biologist's perspective. And you have even brought up along the lines of, birders being able to identify different species of birds in the marsh or, even raptors or whatever. But you kind of had a couple tips and a couple things that you wanted to talk about as far as waterfowl identification and how to improve. So kind of expand on that and let's tell our audience how they can become better waterfowl identification specialists.
This topic came about in terms of something we might want to talk about on the podcast in response to a couple of publications we saw. Well, actually, I guess it was just one publication we saw last year, but then that reminded me of a publication from the early 90s in which in both of these studies, they interviewed in one way or another waterfowl hunters and gauged them on their ability to identify ducks. In one study, they had some mounts, some skins as they're called, of male and female ducks of different species. And the researcher, who actually was my former supervisor down on the Gulf Coast, went to check stations or boat launches, check stations, actually where hunters were leaving the marsh, and presented them, asked them if they wanted to participate, and brought them over to a table and asked them to identify these different study skins that he had. And so he was able to kind of ask them some questions individually and then as a group of hunters to identify these birds, and then recorded their data. And then there was another study here more recently where the researchers actually showed hunters, might have even been conducted at a Ducks Unlimited banquet. It was at some fundraising event of duck hunters, and showed duck hunters pictures of 4 or 5 different species of waterfowl, both male and female. And in both cases, I was kind of surprised at quite frankly, how poor waterfowl hunters did in identifying some of these species. Now, fortunately, in one of the studies, I can't remember which one, but 100% of the people that were asked correctly identified the Drake mallard. But that was, I think that was the only species for which hunters were able to identify it with 100%, 100% of the time, or 100% of the respondents. Some of the others, especially once you get into the females, correct identification rates were probably 30, 40% in some cases. And of course, this is all along the spectrum when you're talking about the species. Fairly consistently, males were identified correctly more often than females. That's to be expected. But nevertheless, that's kind of what brought this up as this is a topic worth talking about because it's interesting and fun and rewarding to be able to correctly identify ducks and geese and swans and other birds on the wing, if you're just a fan of birds. But if you're a waterfowl hunter, it becomes really important from a regulatory standpoint, from the standpoint of your ability to comply with species-specific bag limits that sometimes
absolutely,
that often vary based on species, and for some species vary within based on by sex. For mallards is the best example. Where you can harvest more males than females. So your ability to differentiate these birds before you pull the trigger is paramount for confident harvest and being able to do so without running afoul of the law. So that's kind of what brought this up in terms of what kind of advice can we give. And I've been studying ducks and been bird watching for a couple of decades now, and I still am blown away occasionally whenever I go out with people that are way more skilled at this than I am, that they can see a pair of ducks flying half a mile away across the sky, and they can tell based on wing beat, shape, whatever the case may be, what kind of duck it is. The same case with bird watchers. You can tell if it's a woodpecker. You can tell if it's and tell what kind of woodpecker based on flight pattern or size and shape and all this. And so that's what we'll talk about here today. Some of the most basic aspects that you want to look for when trying to identify, and we'll talk about ducks, geese, and swans here, include things such as, and some of these are going to be obvious, but we'll try to get into some little tricks somewhere along the way. Size of the bird, obviously, it's going to be important. Geese and swans are larger than ducks, no big surprise there. The color of the bird, if you're able to get good sunlight on that bird, you can see some of the color patterns. We've talked on previous episodes about color patterns on the wing. When you see those wings flash, you can certainly get some of those key distinguishing characteristics, and so that's a good key. The shape of the bird, you might think of the silhouette, the slope of the forehead, and certainly from below. One of the things that I find really powerful is the shape of the tail on some duck species. It really differs. You think about a wood duck being a great example, and contrast it to a gadwall. The shape of that tail when they're in flight is a really good key. So that's something that you can pick up on. Now, I'll back up. I have quite a few other kind of characteristics here, but the one thing that I do need to say early on is that to get good at this, just like anything else, it takes practice, practice, practice. You don't get to be a good football, baseball, basketball player, soccer, whatever the case may be, without practice, practice, practice. The same applies here. I'm
a pretty good waterfowl, identifier, even on the wing. But that's something that I still feel like, I can do better in. And I've hunted, and kind of just to go back where you're talking about the studies, the guys or the hunters who were surveyed in those studies who didn't really do that well, a lot of them were novice hunters as well. So, we kind of have to take that into account. And that's something that we have to talk about when you do, we talk about mentoring new hunters and taking people out. And when you take people out hunting, you want to get them as involved in the hunt as possible. So you want them to be interested in what kind of duck is that? It's just, it's not just a duck. Especially when it comes, like you said, to regulations and things, and being able to look up and say, oh, there's two pintails. With young hunters and new hunters, that's pretty impressive. People are all. I've taken a lot of new hunters out. They're like, how did you even know that? And it's like, well, I've done it for 20 years for one, and that's something that people just have to. And I also tell them, well, you don't know the difference anyway, so I could just be lying, right? There is that. But no, I wasn't really lying to them. Not that I would have ever done that, said with greater confidence that I know what that is based on who was with me. No, I would have never done that. But no, I think this is a great conversation to have, and I think a lot of people are going to, should really tune in and really take note of some of the different characteristics that you're getting ready to explain on how to identify these birds. Other things that you can look for, and again, some of this is like process of elimination, because we've got 40 plus species of waterfowl in North America, and so some of this is going to be a process of elimination. You're going to be able to kind of compartmentalize things. You'll be able to tell if it's a goose versus a duck, right? And so then the other thing, once you get into ducks, you can look at differences in things such as the pattern and pace of their wing beat. Divers and sea ducks, your mergansers and birds, golden-eyed birds of that nature, are going to have a faster wing beat pattern as opposed to your dabbling ducks. Now you get into the teal and some of these smaller birds, and they can be a bit deceptive in how fast they're beating their wings. So again, some of this is really nuanced, and again, you can only get good at it through practice. The other thing with respect to practice that I'll mention here, and it's just a little, it's not really a trick, it's just some advice for people. Take some binoculars with you into the blind. If you have access to a wetland during the off season, especially if you're in a northern latitude where you have a lot of breeding ducks, take some binoculars out to a wetland and just watch ducks. It's a great thing to do. But if you're hunting, take some binoculars with you. A lot of times you see birds off in the distance that are nowhere near to decoy, and they're not going to decoy. You've got plenty of downtime where you can take those binoculars and look at the birds off in the distance, study their wing beat patterns, study their shape, birds that are flying high overhead, or maybe after you've gotten your limit, stay out there for
a little bit longer. We've talked about wanting to get out of there as soon as possible to avoid additional disturbance. But, you could spend a bit extra time just watching the birds, using your binocular. It's a great thing to do. Other things that we can't really get into all the specifics of, and like, what does this duck species' tail look like compared to this duck species' tail? We can't. These are just sort of broad categories of things that you will want to look for and try to take note of when you're looking at different species. The shape of the tail, I've kind of already mentioned that. Movement of these birds. If you're a hunter, you will know that mallards come into the decoys typically at a different sort of pace and manner as opposed to teal or canvasbacks. You can use some of those things to kind of help you before you pull the trigger, figure out what kind of bird it is you're going to be shooting. Another great one that I'm sure everyone will know about is your sound, your ability to listen for these birds. Now, we probably all know someone who said they can tell what species of bird it is just based on the way the wind cuts through the wings of these birds. I don't know that anyone is that good to identify every single species based on that, but it's not much of a stretch to say that if you hear the wind ripping through some wings over behind you that sounds like a formation of fighter jets, it might be some species of diver that's ripping down through the sky and diving into your decoys. The same thing with teal. They come in with certain reckless abandon sometimes, it seems. So just kind of pay attention to that. You pick up on a lot of these things just subliminally. The more you're out there, you begin to associate these movements, patterns, sounds. Obviously, the calls of ducks, wood ducks, who among us as duck hunters haven't been in the blind early in the morning and heard a wood duck whistling, female wood duck whistling as it comes through the timber or through the brush. Other good examples of trying to identify what it is based on sound would be a drake mallard, a drake widgeon, drake pintail. They each have their distinctive whistles, and you can hear those, in many cases, birds long before you even see them. So kind of keep that in mind as well. And then some other things that I guess you might say are where you are on the continent, and what type of habitat you're in. You can begin to kind of compartmentalize the duck species that you're most likely to see depending on where you are, and that helps you hone down the number of birds that you're trying to identify as you're kind of going through your mental Rolodex of all the different species that it could possibly be. If you can eliminate some of those from likely occurrence, then that's going to be a good thing. So let me see here, Chris. I'm just looking at my list and trying to see if there's anything else. I think those are some of the biggest ones. A lot of this, again, practice, and you will pick up on these things subliminally. I learned how to identify ducks, and I guess I should say this. All of these other traits that I've talked about here give you hints as to what duck it might be. Farther off at a distance. As those birds get closer, there is no replacement for the ability to identify based on their plumage characteristics. And that information, for a Ducks Unlimited member, there's really no excuse for not being able to identify the majority of waterfowl species, both drakes and hens, because there are hundreds of pictures, I don't know if hundreds, but certainly dozens of pictures of waterfowl in every single Ducks Unlimited magazine. That's actually how I learned. One of the ways that I learned to identify ducks early on is through the Ducks Unlimited magazine. I don't know if we still do, but at one time, we had the species identified on most of the pictures. I think we probably still do, don't we?
Most of them. And then we also have, in the Marsh Watch section, you have the kind of the quiz, the waterfowl ID, where you basically try and pick out the species in the image, and then we provide the answers, and as well as ducks.org. There's just a robust resource, and even on ducks.org and in the DU app, we include sounds, videos, images of every species, every North American species. So like you said, there's not really a great excuse to not be able to identify these birds.
That's right. There are tons of resources out there. And, quite frankly, we as waterfowl hunters, I don't want to really sound like I'm getting on a soapbox, but this is just my personal feeling on this, is that we as waterfowl hunters should really be the best at identifying the ducks that we're harvesting. That's kind of a fundamental responsibility of ours, to be able to identify these birds before we pull the trigger. I get that in many cases for some species it's really difficult, and that difficulty can be amplified if you're in poor light conditions and under certain situations. But it is a very important responsibility of ours to be among the best in the entire conservation and birding community at identifying waterfowl. So that would be my goal for our waterfowl hunting community, is to be among the best at identifying them. And some of our scientific studies right now tell us that that's probably not the case. So there's room for improvement, and it takes time, it takes practice, but it's really cool once you develop those skills.
Yeah, no, and it gives people, a real sense of, community to be able to being able to identify. I've been around people and guys who have hunted for decades, and you're at a marsh or something, and you can, there's a widgeon right there. I didn't see the widgeon. There's a pintail. It really gives people a sense of identity as a waterfowler, as a conservationist, to be able to identify birds like that. And I used to get a bunch of the emails, even some of the social media stuff where we'd get messages coming in, even on Instagram. People will, message, hey, we shot this duck. We don't know what it is. And I would say that roughly 70% of them that we get were goldeneye hens. And so, I would kind of reach out to our audience, just say, hey, take a real good look at some of the diving duck species that are probably more misidentified than just about anything. I mean, I think most people, very few people are going to miss on the pintail, especially when it's sitting right in front of you. Some of a redhead hen and a ringneck hen gets a little close, sometimes. I've seen a lot of people misidentify those, but, I see the diving ducks get a little more misidentified than others. So focus on that.
And that's a great point. I can't believe that I omitted one of the key features that we can look at on ducks to help identify what it is, and that's bill shape, bill structure. Goldeneye is a perfect example. It's sort of a shorter, stubbier bill compared to a merganser, to kind of take it to the extreme. A sawbill, as they're sometimes called. Shovelers is the same way. So there are some of those birds, scoters. You can kind of go down the line. Some of those birds have very distinctive bills, and so that's another trait that you can use. And you also made a good point about relying on your hunting partners. And this is one of the other things that the studies demonstrated, is that the identification rate whenever the hunters got together as a group was higher than for each of those hunters individually on average. And it makes sense, right? The wisdom of crowds type thing in some application of that. But yeah, don't be afraid. Don't be embarrassed to ask your hunting partner that may be better than you at identifying ducks for assistance in identifying. And when they say, oh yeah, look at a pair of pintails over there flying, don't be afraid to ask them, what tipped you off that those were pintails? How did you know? And chances are they will be able to tell you, oh, well, their neck's a little bit longer, maybe a bit more sleeker, and you see how they're doing this. And chances are those people that have that skill are going to enjoy sharing it with you. Most people kind of take pride in being able to share that knowledge. And so if you're one of those people, the other side of this, if you are one of those people that has that knowledge and are willing to share it, thank you for doing so. And I would encourage everyone that has that knowledge to really look for opportunities to do so. We can educate ourselves as a collective community, and I think it's a great thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Waterfowl ID is extremely important. Like you said, it's a great thing for Ducks Unlimited members, supporters to know, for waterfowl hunters, for conservationists, even birders, to learn more about these spectacular birds and all these various different species throughout North America. Mike, I appreciate this. Has been, eye-opening for me. I know I even as someone who's hunted for 20 years, I still, I'm not afraid to ask or even look up on the DU app, like, what was that? Or especially, I was in Canada and we were shooting, scoters, and I was lost. So, it's one of those deals where, even if you've done it for 20 years, it's still a good idea to have a handy guide and a pair of binoculars on hand.
That's right. And do a little refresher course before the hunting season every year. Just have your bird identification guide, if it's Sibley's guide, if it's National Geographic, if it's just something online, just, make it just be one of the things that you do to prepare for the waterfowl hunting season. And hey, look at it this way. It's another day that you can, it's another thing that you can fill your hours or days leading up to the hunting season doing. It just kind of helps to bridge that gap of those summer doldrums in between the closing and opening of hunting season. So yeah, to look at it that way.
Absolutely. Thanks a lot, Mike. And I'd like to thank our producer, Clay Baird, for producing the Ducks Unlimited podcast. And I'd like to thank you, the listener, for touching up on your waterfowl ID before the season, and also for listening to the podcast and supporting wetlands conservation.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the DU Podcast. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to the show, and visit www.ducks.org/DU Podcast for resources based on today's topics, as well as access to more episodes. Opinions expressed by guests do not necessarily reflect those of Ducks Unlimited. Until next time, stay tuned to the Ducks.